Battleground Badger State is going to receive more attention next week. This afternoon, the White House announcing President Biden will visit Milwaukee next week. The First Lady was in the state last Sunday, the Vice President in Madison this past week as well, and now the President will return Wednesday. And this comes on the heels of last night's State of the Union address. President Biden delivering his fourth State of the Union address. He's hoping it's not his last, and it sounded like a campaign speech, just a long one, 1 hour and 7 minutes. And joining us now is WBAY's Washington News Bureau correspondent, Brendan Cullerton. We visited with him before. So let's just get to the main message. What do you think the president got across last night, and was that what he was intending to get across?
Well, Chris, it did read very much like a campaign speech. Yeah. We're 8 months away from the election. I was talking to probably 30 Democrats yesterday. A lot of them said, this has the opportunity for the president to kind of launch his campaign with the general American audience. He gets the microphone, he gets the spotlight. There's no one dissecting his words at the time. And he used a lot of that time to draw direct comparisons to him and Donald Trump. He mentioned Trump more than 10 times, pointing out the differences, whether it's, access to reproductive health care, whether it's Biden saying he was able to forge a compromise at the border that Trump eventually derailed. He was, just saying that he's more of a unity guy, saying that Trump is divisive. He really used it to say that he's a better option for voters than Donald Trump. You see that a lot in kind of these election year states of the union. Democrats were pretty happy with the performance. He had a lot of energy. 67 minutes. He was pretty fiery. He called out Donald Trump a few times. Obviously, Republicans are going to pan the speech, but sure, Democrats did seem happy with what the president got across.
Yeah, key word there, energy, and also managed to do all that without ever mentioning Donald Trump by name. Apparently, there's a new candidate for president. He's called my predecessor, so that we got
my predecessor. He's been doing that for weeks, by the way.
Right, yeah.
He just went to the border. He continually calls him my predecessor.
Right, the GOP nominee is my predecessor. As for that Republican response, it was delivered by Alabama Senator Katie Britt. What I noted from that, Brendan, was the way in which it was framed, the way in which it was shot. It was at a kitchen table. Years ago, that used to be like the Democrat thing, right? We're going to talk about kitchen table and where it hits America. What did you think about the response?
Well, I'll leave my opinion out of it, but unlike Biden's speech, which Democrats really liked, there were Republicans that appreciated what Katie Britt did, saying, let's bring it to the kitchen tables. Let's talk about everyday American issues like crime and inflation. But there were even Republicans that kind of panned it, saying it was, more like an acting speech. Yes, there were some people that were critical of almost the performance, saying it was a little over dramatic. It's not everyone. There were Republicans, we just looked at Tommy Tuberville, her fellow Alabama senator, saying he was proud of the performance. But there was a little more criticism, I think, just kind of nationally of Britt than there was of Biden. And that's pretty normal. These responses to the State of the Union, it's a very different makeup. You're not in Congress. You're by yourself. If you remember a few years ago, the Rubio incident with the water bottle, they're just kind of, they often receive criticism. Sure. This one did as well.
All right, the government has to get back to business, but how long they'll remain in business is certainly a question. Brendan, the funding bill, midnight tonight is the deadline. Where do we stand at that? Where do we stand on that? Excuse me.
It looks a little bit worse than it did this morning. I think the general consensus was the House was going to be the hurdle, and they passed it earlier this week. The Senate did clear a procedural hurdle on this vote, but now they're trying to add amendments, and we didn't really expect this today. So that does make it seem like there might be at least a partial government shutdown, clock striking midnight, without passing this, because if they are forced to add amendments, that means it needs to go back to the House, and they're already gone. So there is a possibility here that the clock strikes midnight without a deal.
All right, Brendan, thanks so much for the update. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Chris.